Welcome back to the Kieran Show. This week is singular Kieran. I'm on my own. So this is going to be a video about how I paint it. Not how you should paint, just how I paint it. So if there's any tips or tricks or any colours you want to steal, they'll all be in this video. Before we start, thank you very much to Games Workshop for sending us over the new Wolfguard releases. So this is the Wolfguard Terminators, Logan Grimnar and Arjak Rotfist. Kieran did a really scary thing to Arjak. He's made him into like some heretical chaplain thing. There'll be a picture on screen, but he's made it chaos and it'd look cool if it was Space Marines. So for the purpose of this video, I am going to use the new Wolfguard Terminator. These are amazing miniatures. They are unbelievable to build. They are packed with detail, which is a little daunting to think that, you know, you've got to paint all these things because otherwise they're just going to look a bit weird. You'll notice that I've left the left or right. It's left or right, the shoulder pad. I know which one it is. I think it is their right, our left. Nailed it. The shoulder pad off because this is going to be white in the scheme that I did. So I've stuck that to a bit of cocktail stick, so that when we come to spraying paints around and getting all messy, we don't get overspray. I've primed the whole miniature in matte black from the Colourforge. There's an argument you could use Wolf King Grey here, but I find that by starting all of my miniatures with black, when I come to apply the paints from above, we get some black left in the recesses and it helps with that separation. Before we click off this video, I will be using an airbrush. But before we click off, the way I paint is because I'm quite messy. I only airbrush things that I know that I can do by hand as well. Yes, they might take longer, but they're only things I know that I can fix if I get, you know, paint overspill, which happens to me all the time. So don't click off. I will be using an airbrush. This is just for speed. Just a word on that, if you don't have an airbrush already, I'd absolutely recommend getting one, even if it's just for priming and base coating, because it's such a time saver. So let's get into it. The first thing here is we're going to be airbrushing the Fang over the top of the Colourforge. This is so that we get black left in the recesses. So with the Fang loaded up in the airbrush, we're going to apply this almost zenithally from the top down on top of the matte black from the Colourforge. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this does a lot of the heavy lifting for us because we'll be left with black in all of the recesses. So we don't want to blow out all the details, so I'm not spraying from underneath, just from the top, just to get a nice base coat, but still leaving the recesses as black. We want a nice smooth coat here, so I am doing 2 passes with the airbrush with thin paint. So you can see from the way I'm doing this, I'm not applying it from underneath, it's just from the top. So with 2 coats applied through the airbrush, you can see that we do maintain some of that black in the recesses, and you can see we've got a nice blue tone over all of the miniature. I've also done this to Logan Grimnar as well, as you can see on screen. He's also out on pre-order as well at the time of this video. He's an amazing miniature. I built him in sub-assemblies, but here is him himself. I'm not going to be painting him in the rest of the video. He might pop up every now and again, but because he's such an awesome miniature, I will be taking my time with him. You'll see him at the end fully painted for this video as well though. Also, drop pods, because, you know, we needed new drop pods. This is what the scheme looks like on them as well. I will be putting these in my Space Wolf Force. Yeah, these are just massive. So now we move on to our first highlight, and for this, I'm going to be using AK Pale Blue. So this will be on like the tops of the knee pads, any sections where highlights would hit, but we don't want to blow away all of the Fang. So we maintain some nice contrast across all of the miniature. It's a lovely color, but it is quite a jump up in contrast compared to the Fang. So we want to go nice and easy, smooth coats, thin paint. So for applying the pale blue, I have switched to a smaller airbrush. I am going to be using the Galeri Mobius 0.2 that they sent over to us, so thank you very much to them. There's a link in the description if you want to pick up one yourself, like I mentioned, but enough shilling. Yeah, this is a 0.2, so this will be really good for applying the highlights in the small areas and not blowing away all of the detail. But yeah, with the pale blue, just applying that in smaller areas. So like I mentioned, on top of the knee pads, on top of the shoulder pad that isn't going to be white, any of the armor panels, just to create a nice gradient. The other thing I would say is if you are going to airbrush AK paints is you have to use flow improver. They seem to dry with like some weird scum left in the cup, which is a nightmare to get out. So I'll always put a drop or 2 of flow improver in any AK paint that I airbrush. Just makes cleaning it out so much easier, and it stops it drying on the needle and getting all the gunk in the end of the nozzle. Especially if you're using this is a 0.2 needle. If you've got a smaller nozzle at the end, the paint builds up quicker and clogs very quickly. We're applying this to all of the top facing areas, so it's like the knees, the feet, all of it. It's just a case of working around the model really to all of the high points and filling them in. So with a couple of passes of the pale blue applied, this is where we're at. It's quite speckly because, like I mentioned, it is quite a jump up in value, so we get a bit of speckling, but we can fix that later on because we're coming back in with glazes and stuff to tie all this together to remove any of those speckles. I find that I get more speckly paint with lighter paint. I don't know if it's the way that pigment works. I'm not a pigment doctor. So on top of that pale blue, we're going to apply another highlight, and this time it's sky grey. Again, this is another jump up in value, so we want to make sure that this goes in a smaller area, nice and thin as well. So I'm going to put this onto the top, very top of each section. again, inside that pale blue, not overpowering it. So we're going to take, again, the top of the knee pad, the top of the shoulder pad, just put it in a nice small area. We're going to come back and reinforce this later on with brush highlights and glazes and stuff anyway, but this is essentially just mapping out those ultra high points. I have thinned this more than I normally would because it's such a bright color. You can always add more, you can't take it away. You'll notice that I do a lot of my painting first on the glove that's on my hand. I do this so I know that what paint I'm putting down, how that's going to affect the previous layers. So when I've base coated the Fang, I've base coated a patch on my glove. Again, with the AK paints, I put them in a smaller area so I can see how the transitions work and what color tone we've got. It also means that when I come back in with glazes later on, I can see how much I need to refine that. So this is the miniature with the pass of Sky Grey applied. You can see that it just adds a little bit more shine into those highlights to the really high points. The Sky Grey really pushes it more towards grey rather than the pale blue and the Fang, so we get that lovely contrast built up. It is quite an organic process when you're going through this, though. I quite often will go backwards and forwards across these three paints. So let's move on to that now. So now it's done, we're essentially going to go back around the whole thing, but this time with glazes. So first up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to glaze back the Fang from underneath to try and remove some of that speckling and blend those layers together. I've thinned the Fang down to a glaze consistency in my airbrush and we'll be applying this through small puffs from below the miniature and across those transition lines between the Fang and the pale blue from earlier. And because, like I said earlier, I used the back of my glove, I can go around the outside where the transition is on my glove and blend those two together, and I can see how thick I need to make the paint to get that transition nice and aligned. So for example, as you can see, I've got a line of the Fang here and I've got a line of pale blue here, just applying a small glaze around that to bring it all together. So essentially what we've got to do is do this on a much smaller scale across all of the miniature. So the way I go about this is starting from essentially the miniature upside down and go from the bottom and see how that solves some of the transitions. But depending on the miniature, you might be able to catch most of them this way. Some of them, like, if you've got one of the Terminators, for example, is quite hunched over, you're not going to get into all of the recesses or the dark bits there. We need to make sure that we go in manually, carefully to fill those back in. But for most of them, you can do most of the legwork from underneath though. So essentially you could kind of describe this as you're putting back in liquid contrast, not contrast paint as in contrast paint, just contrast as in the thing. This is down to personal preference. You might be able to skip this step if you don't, if you're batch painting or if you're doing a whole army, you might not need to come back in with glazes. When all of the miniatures are together, it might be fine. The key takeaway here is it is an organic process. Once we've gone through all of the following glazes, we can come back in and blend all these together. So with the Fang glaze applied back in to bring out those transitions to the pale blue, we then move up to the colours that we did previously. So with some pale blue really thin in the airbrush, we can apply this really sparingly because we've already got quite a lot of pale blue down on the miniature. This is just to help blend out the transitions and reinforce that colour. So really sparingly applied to the high points, just again, blend those highlights into the Sky Grey, the Fang. This is like the mid highlight kind of, because it's not the mid-tone. The mid-tone is that transition between the Fang and pale blue, not this bit. So again, just blend all those layers together and this is how it will look. You can see it's got nice transitions. It gets rid of quite a lot of the speckliness between the Fang and the pale blue. And then the last step here, literally going to do the exact same thing again with Sky Grey. It's another glaze. Again, I'll apply this glaze into the places where the Sky Grey was before. Again, just to blend it together and help with the contrast between the three colours. So the last step, this is the last step on the armour, to apply the glaze of the Sky Grey. Again, this is really thin in the airbrush cup, so it's essentially reinforcing the bits we did earlier on, just at the really high points. Again, like I keep saying, it's an organic process, so if you're not happy when you get to this point, go back round till you get happy. You can go as light or as dark as you want. If you want to lean more into a grey style Terminator, you could go with far more Sky Grey and less of the Fang showing through. It's down to personal preference. We're out the other side of the glazes of the glazes of the Fang, out the other side of the glazes of the pale blue and the Sky Grey. It's all in the same places where they were before, like I keep mentioning, just to bring those layers together. You can see it gives a lovely tone of blue that just sets up everything else. I mean, we will have more refinement later on with edge highlights, weathering and scratches and all those other gubbins. It's also been done on Logan Grimnar as well. Again, he's probably had more glazes than the Terminator. I went far more organically between the layers here because he's the Big Mac Daddy of Space Marines, Got to spend more time on him. And while we're talking about adapting it across other miniature, here is the drop pods. These are massive. I haven't done glazes on these. These have just had straight paint. Because they're such bigger armor panels, I find I don't need the glazes to reinforce or bring them up as much. They will have edge highlights later on, but they're just straight paint. I haven't bothered with the glazes here. Going to the Wayward shoulder pad now. Again, while we've got the airbrush out, I'm going to base coat this in silver grey from Vallejo. This is just an all over coat, nice and thin through the airbrush, and then on top of that we're going to apply Tamiya flat white just to add a little highlight. For this next step, I go backwards and forwards on in mini painting in general all the time, whether I actually need it or not, because I've had a few bad experiences where I've rubbed paint off, and then sometimes I've had no issues. Sometimes it's been fine, sometimes it hasn't, but we're going to put a gloss varnish down to protect all those airbrush layers. Airbrush paint is quite thin. There's like some micron thing that you can look at for how like thin the paint is, but I find that when we come back in with oils and stuff later on, there is a chance that we can rub it off, and I have done previously. So now, like I said, I go backwards and forwards on it, but now I just do it because it's easier to do it and not have a bad experience again. So I'm giving this a couple of coats of gloss varnish, just this polyurethane Vallejo varnish. Like I said, it's gloss, so it'll lock in all of those colours nicely, add a nice layer of protection. This will also mean that we can add some transfers, and when we come to put oil washes on later, the surface tension gets broken nicely, so it'll run into the recesses a bit more. So I'm applying this with an older airbrush. I get worried about putting this in the nice fancy airbrushes. I don't know whether I'm going to gum up the needle or something, but I use my old airbrush for this. This is like my varnishing airbrush now. With those gloss varnishes dried, it's time to put some transfers on before we do an oil wash. I won't bore you with how to apply transfer. There's 1,000,001 videos on YouTube how to apply transfers to Warhammer miniatures, but essentially I'm going to use Microsol and Microset to put these in cool places on the miniature, like the shoulder pad, maybe a couple runes here and there. With those transfers on and dry, it's time to put the oils on before we can varnish all of that back in. I find that these ABT AK502 oils dry a bit faster, but I do use Winsor & Newton oils as well. They pretty much do the same thing, but I just find these 502 ones just dry a bit quicker. So I've mixed up some oils in these cute little metal petri dishes that I picked off Amazon. Really good for oil paints. They're really easy to clean. Got a nice bowl on them so you know how much mineral spirit to put in. So I normally put in about half oil paint to half mineral spirit and then adjust from there, depending on the colour. Sometimes like black, I find I need to thin out a bit more as we go further on, or like a white, when you try and do fancy OSL, I find needs thinning way more than a black. I don't know why. I also use the nodule rivets nodule things that are on this like little palette that I've got. They're really good for testing the flow of the oil. Like, you know, if the oil is flowing all the way around, I know that I can then apply it to the miniature. I'll also check how thick or how dark that oil wash is going to look by just applying it over the white sections of the wet palette. Because it's white, you can see it come through nice and easily and judge how dark you want it to be. So now comes the satisfying bit. This is to literally go around all of the recesses on the Terminator and apply all the oil and watch the magic work. Anybody that's watched a YouTube video before about oil washes know how satisfying they are. It's brilliant to watch. It's like magic. You put it in, it fills the recess, job done. So it's literally a case of just putting the brush in each of the recesses and letting it flow all over the recesses that are connected. Because of the surface tension, I think it is, it will fill them out nicely. You just touch it, watch it fly all around the recesses, move on with your life. So that is the black pin wash pretty much done. We will come back in and tidy this up because there's a couple of edges where it's spilled over or if it all started to separate. But that's the joy of oils, you know, once they're down, you can still work them and not like acrylic paint where, you know, you've got such a small window to fix your mistakes. So the oils have had about half an hour to dry, so they've lost that sheen, but now we can come in and start clearing them up. So it's safe to go back around, clear up any of those mistakes that we've had. So go straight on mineral spirit on a brush that's really soft, nice synthetic brush. I do have a cotton bud on hand if I need to be a bit more heavy-handed, but I do find I leave fibers and things, so I do try to use the brush where I can. But the stubborn ones, I do find I have to use a cotton bud every now and again. So you can see on the top of this recess, there's a little bit of overflow. I just wipe it ever so slightly, nice and lightly with the damp brush, just to clear off any of that overspill. So it's just a case of going around and clearing up any of the ones you want. To be honest, even if there is some overspill, you could probably cover it up with highlights or, you know, put it down to weathering if you didn't want to do this step. So it's been a couple of hours now, so the oils have lost the glossy wet sheen that they get when they first go on. So it's pretty sure it's safe to varnish now. So what we're going to do is come back in with some matte polyurethane matte varnish from Vallejo, just cover it over the top. 2 really thin coats because I don't want to create any texture because you've got nice gradients on the blue. We don't want to overspray the varnish and build up like a frosty texture or anything. I do 2 really thin coats of the matte varnish on top of all of this to lock the transfers in, lock the oils in, protect all that stuff. So when we come back in later on and you're handling it, you're not going to rub off paint. So with the matte varnish dry, it's time to move on to what is probably my favorite bit of any painting job, to be honest. It's where the miniature starts to actually look real rather than just an airbrushed thing. This first step is I'm going to go and block everything in that's going to be a metallic or a dark colour, just to start getting some separation. What I use for this is a couple of coats of Black Legion. This will really set up the recesses and whatnot for later on as well, for the metallic specifically. I'll also block in the belt because the scheme I've gone with uses black for the belt as well. Also block in any of the rubber bits for the seals in between the armour, so that's like the bits in between the legs, the hips, the wrists. You know the bits I'm on about. Probably one of my favourite bits of painting Space Marines because, like I said, you start to see it take effect. You start to see the cool gradients you've got because you're putting in separation between it all. While the Black Legion dries, I'm going to block in a couple of the metallics that aren't going over the top of the Black Legion. So this is like the brassy gold kind of colour. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to base coat these in decayed metal, just a case of going around, blocking in, for example, the chest aquila on the front of the armour, also blocking like the weird little hats that sit on top of the wolf tails, and just any other details I fancy being gold. I do try to block in different details gold across all the miniatures, just so that they don't all look the same, just so they've got a bit more personality. Some of them I'll do, like, for example, the hats as silver, like I did on my Grey Hunters, and some of them gold, just to add some flair. So next I'm going to go around and block in any of the grey details with Teneberous Grey. Teneberous Grey, I don't really know how to pronounce it, but that's the colour it is. So I'm going to use this on the Crux Terminatus on the shoulder pad, and also the little one that's on some of their knee pads. And I'll also go around and block in the little skulls on the wrists as well, if they have any. With the Teneberous Grey details all blocked in on the knees and the shoulder pad, it's time to go back around and block in all the metallics that we base coated earlier with the Black Legion. So what I'm going to use for this is dark aluminium by Vallejo metal colour. So it's just a case of going around any metallic details with the dark aluminium that you want to be metallic. So this is like the muzzles of the bolters. I've blocked in the swords to come back in later on. Any vents if you're doing normal Space Marines, although to be fair, the Terminators do have vents on the back as well. Last couple of bits to do here is to go around and block in all of the trinkets and gubbins that these cool miniatures are covered in. So this is like the teeth, the claws, the little rune stones, any other little gubbins. For the teeth, what I'm going to do is block these in with Dragon Fang by Two Thin Coats. Any of the runes I'll go and cover in Dawnstone, and this little strap here I'm going to cover in a dark red. I'm going to use black red by AK here, but you could just use any blackish red kind of colour. So I'm going to go around and do these off camera just because there's so many of them. Highlights. We're now into that stage. So the first highlight that we're going to put on is Rune Lord Brass on top of the decayed metal. For this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover up about 75% of the decayed metal from earlier. What this will do is it'll leave a nice feel to give this like a warmish old gold, maybe a more brassy feel to it. So like I said, I'm going to cover up 75%-ish of the base coat just over the top. So for example here, I'm going to use the chest aquila. It's literally just a case of going around and picking each of the raised fins for that detail. The aquila is probably the most annoying bit to do because you've got individual fins to go around. With the Rune Lord Brass applied to the top of the decayed metal, it definitely gives it a nice old gold vibe rather than a shiny yellow gold. It also helps blend in with the overall cold tone of the miniature without adding in too much warmth. Next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some finer highlights on top of that Rune Lord Brass with Mythril blade from Two Thin Coats. This is just the super sharp highlights for those brass details, just picking out the absolute edges of them. I'll also add this to any other metallic details we've got, so for example any vents that need highlighting or the top of the gun barrels like over here. We will come back in and wash the metallic details later on just to tie them together a bit more. We've got another round of oil washes to go at the end, so we'll tackle those. Moving on to highlighting the grey details, so we're going back to those Teneberous Grey details that we did earlier. The first highlight we've got here is going to put some Dawnstone down. Similar to how I did with the decayed metal and the Rune Lord Brass, I'm just applying this over the top of the Crux Terminatus on the shoulder pad. It's got lines, so you can literally just follow and try and not put the brush into the recesses, just so we leave some of the Teneberous Grey showing as well. And then following the same approach we did with the Mythril blade on the Rune Lord Brass, we've got Administratum Grey on top of the grey details that we just blocked in with Dawnstone. Again, working in a smaller area just to add this as a fine highlight to them. With those grey details blocked in, what we're going to do is move on to highlighting the rest of the black details. So for this, what I'm going to use is Army Painter's Uniform Grey. I'm going to apply this really thinly around the edge of the gun casing, any of the other black details like the knife sheath that's on his belt, or any other black details that blocked in. Applying this really thin around these edges just because it's quite a jump up compared to the black. We don't want to put any chunky highlights so it looks a bit odd. Just applied nice and thin, nice and small around those edges. Next up on the highlight train, it's the white shoulder pad that we blocked in earlier. What we're going to do with this is take just a generic white paint to block this in and edge highlight it. So it's just a case of going around the outside of the shoulder pad at a nice crisp line. It really helps sell that dirty white underneath. What you can do as well is apply some scratches here just to add some weathering and just some more definition, because you know it's quite a big detail on the miniature, but if you add some scratches it adds some nice definition here. Before we move on to highlighting the behemoth that is the blue armour, I'm going to finish off the wolf pelts that are hanging from each of the, like they're hanging from their legs and various other places. So for these tails, what I'm going to do is give it a really small dry brush first of Reddish Grey by AK, and then an even smaller dry brush of warm grey just to add some highlights. And then what I'll also do is pick out the very tips of them by brush just to add some contrast across the tails as well. We will give the wolf pelt a wash later on when we come back round with the oils, just to tie them together and just to add some of the recesses back in, but we'll cover that later on. We don't have a great deal of stuff left to do, but it is a big step, and that's highlighting all of the blue armour. This takes the longest of the whole miniature, maybe second to the airbrushing, because when I do that I do it over loads of things like a madman rather than doing just one miniature. But this step is lengthy, but I find it does the most heavy lifting for the overall tone of the miniature, and I do really like to take my time with it because it's the most satisfying. It's pretty much the same as how we did the airbrushing highlights earlier. First of all, it's a pale blue edge highlight all around the outside. So I'm going to apply this to the most pronounced areas. I'm not going to go over every edge with this because I don't have the time or the inclination. I think if I had to do that, I would pull my eyes out. So I mainly focus on like the leading foot, the top of the knees that we'll do this on, and also just putting scratches down here and there as well, like a couple of dot ones, just to add some definition and contrast onto those armor panels. And every now and again across each panel I'll do scratches. There's no rhyme or reason here. Again, it's just, like I've said a few times in this video, it's an organic process to go round. Just follow what the brush wants to do and how you want it to look. So we're on the home stretch now for getting this miniature finished, and we're on to the final highlight for the blue armor. For this, it's the sky grey. Like we did with the airbrush, we're applying this to the super fine sections of the armor. So this is like the corner bits of like the feet, for example, any of the panels that are really facing upwards. So I like to put some on the front of the foot and also put spot highlights on the shoulder pads as well. And again, picking out the superfine corners of the armor panels. And again, I try to apply a bit inside the scratches as well, just to give those scratches some definition as well. What I'll also do is I'll thin this down really thinly as well. And again, try and blend out any of the bits that, you know, look a bit too stark in terms of the way the highlight's looking. So like on the one on the shoulder pad, I thinned down some of the sky grey quite thinly and applied that as like a glaze slash kind of thing, just to blend that spot together. I'll also pick out all of the rivets as well with the sky grey. Just again, this is going to add some more definition to the armour. So just a case of going around and picking out each of the spot for the rivets. This can be quite tedious if you've got one that's got lots of rivets, but I really find that this does help. So with the blue armour all done, we're going to apply some brown chipping later on, but we'll come to that in a second. I'm going to go over to the sword. So what I'm going to do with the sword is I'm going to block it in with black metal by scale 75. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this with plate armour by 2 thin coats, just as a chunky highlight around the outside, applying some reflections almost as slashes across the front of the blade. And then what we're going to do is use Mythril blade again, going around the same sections, adding a superfine highlight like to the pointy end and inside any of those reflections, just to add a more fine highlight to it. So the final steps now, we're going back to oils like we used at the start. This time we're going to wash the details that we've blocked in and highlighted just to blend them all together. So what I've done here is I've mixed up a black oil wash and also a brown oil wash. The brown oil wash has a tiny bit of black in just to darken it down a bit. The brown I have here, I just find a bit too brown, and when it goes on top of like the gold details, it doesn't look right. So just adding a little bit of black in there, moving it towards like an old school Agrax Earth shade kind of feel. So the colours for reference here are the ABT 502 oil that we used earlier, the ivory black, and I'm also using Burnt Umber by Winsor & Newton. So what we're going to do is I'm going to apply the brown oil wash to all of the gold metallic details we did earlier. So that's an all over wash over the chest aquila, any of the gold little hats that we've put across the wolf pelts, and I'm also washing the actual wolf pelts themselves with this brown wash just to add some definition in there. You could go with black here, but I find the brown just adds a bit more interest to fur over black. And then with the black oil wash, what we're going to do is go and block in any of the rune details. I did off camera highlight these with Dawnstone as well, just to pick them out. We're blocking these in. When I say blocking in, what we're doing is we're putting the black oil wash inside the little rune detail that's inside, just to add some definition. What we'll also do with this black oil wash is also go and wash any of the metallic details that we did earlier. So for example, on this sword, we've got like rune cutouts on the front of it. We'll block that in with the oil wash as well, and also wash the gun barrels and any other metallic details that we have. Final step on the armor is to now go in with some brown sponge chipping kind of stuff. So what I'm going to use for this is a brown. You could use Rhinox hide for this, but what I'm going to use is Grim Brown by AK. So I've got some reverse tweezers here with a bit of sponge stuck in them. I've got a bit of brown there. All I'm going to do here is dip the sponge in there, wipe off most of it, and then it's just a case of pressing it into a few select areas. There's no real rhyme or reason here. It's just wherever will look cool or where you think rocks and other bits of dirt would get kicked up. I'll also add it in a few dots and pull it down. So for example, around the rivets, I've put a bit in there and pulled it down just to add like a streak. You could use streaking grind for this, but I find it changes the overall feel of the miniature and discolors the armor around it too much. So that's why I've gone with the acrylic paint here. There's no rhyme or reason to this brown chipping. Just apply it anywhere. You can apply as much or as little as you want. The only other place to do it as well is on the white as well, and to blend and add some chips into the transfer as well. So that's the miniature done now. We've only got the face and the base left. So we're going to do the base first, and then we'll do the face at the end. I'm by no means an expert on painting faces, but I'll show you how I do it. There are people that are way better at painting faces, so probably go and watch them. As with all of my miniatures, I stick things on stupid bits of cork, you know, modeling for disadvantage here. So this guy is stood on like a giant piece of what I'm going to paint as frozen rock. And it's the same for how I did the Wolfguard Battle Leader. Chunks of just mountain almost is how I envisage them looking. So for the bases, the first step is to block the whole base in with Dark Sea Blue by Vallejo. And then what we're going to do is going to stipple and wet blend a few colours. So we'll use Sotek Green and then Temple Guard Blue. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll do Bright Sapphire in a smaller area. So first up, base coating everything in Dark Sea Blue, making sure that we get a nice consistent coverage here, because this is the main base colour for the bases. What I'll do is I'll add, because I'm going over cork, I'll make sure I add some water to this just so it flows into all the nooks and crannies of the cork rock that I'm painting. And then what we're going to do is going to move on to the stippling for the Sotek Green and Temple Guard Blue. All we're doing with this is applying it across like the volumes of the rock, just getting some on the end of the brush, slapping it around into that wet Dark Sea Blue and just going across the whole piece of cork. Again, then doing the same with the brighter colours, again putting in a smaller area, stippling just so it all blends together. Well, there's no rhyme or reason here. What I'm trying to do is essentially just follow where the rock would meet or look at the sky, just because I think that's where the brightest points of the rock would be, and also where the less rock, more ice kind of thing. So the last colour that we're stippling here is the Bright Sapphire. This is from the Army Painter range. Again, just applying it in a smaller area across those volumes of the rock. Because there's quite a lot of paint kicking around here, we do need to make sure we leave this to dry for a good amount of time. We don't want to disrupt any of that in these next stage or spill it anywhere else. So what we're essentially going to do now is an overbrush of that Bright Sapphire we just used a moment ago. A nice soft synthetic brush here, making sure to brush off most of it on a bit of kitchen towel. And then on top of that, what we're going to use is a cold white. So I've got cold white by Vallejo here. You could use any white really. Use bold titanium white if you wanted to. But with the cold white, what I'm doing is the same as I just did with the Bright Sapphire, but in a softer, smaller area. So this isn't as a heavier overbrush. This is just more of a, to pick out the edges. This is the highlight for the base. So it's a case of going around the whole thing, picking out all of those raised bits of the cork or the texture paste that's underneath. So that's the base painted and dry brush and all done. I've waxed a couple of frozen tufts here as well, just to break up the cork a bit. Otherwise, it just without the frozen tufts, it can look a bit boring and static, whereas I find that tufts just break it up. So now we're going to put some actual snow on the base. So what we're going to use for this is Vallejo Ground Texture Snow. I really like this one. There's plenty of snows on the market, but this is the one that I've chosen to use for the army. All we're going to do with this is apply it in random big clumps across the miniature. So there's no rhyme or reason here. Taking a nice clump on a texture spludger or whatever they're called, applying it to the front of the rock, and then a little bit as if it's fallen down like a snowdrift. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a wet brush and blend those edges of the snow out into the base. just to make it look a bit more coherent rather than snow has just been dumped on the top of this rock, just like it's, you know, it's built up over time or it's melted, whichever. The only other step to do with the snow is to make sure that we blend the feet into the base. You know, like these guys aren't going to be pristine, they're trudging through a snow mountain. So what I'll do is I'll take some and on the end of my brush and apply it to an area of the legs, clean off the brush, wet it, and then blend that out across the feet, just pulling it up to the top of the shins. There's no rhyme or reason here, just to make it look organic and like they're actually in the environment. We don't want to put too much on here because it look like they're just wearing snowshoes. The last bit of the snow is these snow micro balloons. I don't really know what this product is. It's like a really thin snow flock. All I'm going to do is grab like a finger's worth and just sprinkle this on top of the base. I find that this added to the top clumps of where the most snow is just adds a nice powdery feel to it and gives it a real snow feel. The very last step for the base is while everything's still a bit wet, we get some of the dark sea blue that we used earlier, thin it down to a really thin wash, and just go back in and bring back any of those recesses that we might have knocked out with the overbrushing earlier on. So for example, on this miniature specifically, I'm doing this across the front bottom section where the rock meets the snow. Again, and then cleaning the brush off, feathering that out just to blend it back in. So it's just a case of going around and picking out any recesses where you think you could add a bit more contrast on the base. The last step here is the faces. So I'm by no means an expert here, but this is how I go about painting faces at the moment. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to block / shade the whole face with Violet Red by AK. This just adds a nice like foundation to build off, I find. Thin this down into somewhere between a wash and a layer, probably more nearer to a wash, and apply just all over the skin. Like I said, I'm not by no means expert, but I know that the key to getting a good face paint is thin paint. So what we're going to do is build up layers and glazes really slowly. Again, because it's an organic thing, this is an organic process. So the first highlight color we're going to put on top of this is Athena Skin by Vallejo. This is really thin. Again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this up over a couple of layers, gradually moving in, so we end up with a nice transition between that and the violet red. Also, what I'll do here is I'll thin down Athena Skin into a glaze and just try and blend this color into the violet red as much as I can. On top of that Athena Skin, we're then going to apply a mix of Athena Skin 1:1 with basic skin tone by AK. Again, working with really thin layers here and glazes to bridge the gap between the previous paints. This has to be an organic process. When I'm doing this, I can't record every step because I'm constantly going backwards and forwards between the Athena Skin mix or the Athena Skin and basic skin tone mix. Like I have to go between them because they're so small. The key here is using the glazes to tie everything together because like I said, it's such a small area. The glazes really help, you know, blur out the layer lines almost. So what we're going to do is then move on to just pure basic skin tone by AK. Again, doing the same thing, applying this in a smaller area, applying it as a highlight, maybe a glaze if we need to thin it out a bit where it's too stark compared to the previous mix. At this stage, when I've done all of these glazes, I'll then go back with a super thin glaze of the violet red, just around any details where we've knocked out too much of that nice purple undertone. So for example, this is the bit where the head meets the bottom of the helmet, or where is the deep recesses of the nose. You don't need to do this because sometimes I find I don't blow out all of that purple detail, so I don't have to. But if I do, this is the stage where I'll go back and do it. And before putting a final highlight on the face, what I need to do is we need some context around where we're pushing the color on the face. And the main thing here is the hair. If we block in the hair, we'll get a really good feel for how good the face paint job is looking. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to base coat all of the hair, the beard, the eyebrows, any of that stuff in Dragon Fang. Just making sure it's nice and thin, just so we don't obscure any of the cool details like in the braids or the beard. With the Dragon Fang all dry, what we're going to do is apply a contrast paint really thinly over the top of this. For what I'm going to use is Skeleton Horde. Now I'm going to thin this out with a bit of water and then just apply it as an all over coat to all of the hair. Again, trying really hard to not get this on the face because it's a dark color. Just taking your time, going around all the tassels, all of the hair, just to fill in those recesses. With that Skeleton Horde all dry, we're then going to go back to Dragon Fang and start to put a chunky highlight in just to bring some brightness back to that hair. So this is a case of just going around the whole thing, picking out that hair. any of the highlights. This, because it's so near to the previous colour, it should apply really nicely and apply really smoothly and not look like too much of a big jump up in colour. So on top of that dragon fang, we're then going to move on to putting proper highlights onto the hair and, you know, to add some nice feel to it. So for the highlight on the hair, what I'm going to use is Vallejo Buff. This is quite a yellowy but a nice jump up in value compared to the colours that are underneath. We're just applying this to the edges of the hair, almost like edge highlighting the hair, but essentially where the hair is looking at the sky or the light source the most. This is quite a tedious process because it's such small details, but you do have to take your time here because you don't want to ruin any of the underlying tone of the hair, and you also don't want to get any on the face as well. With the hair highlighted, the head is done. This is such a relief when you get to this stage, because I personally hate painting faces, so when I get to the end of painting a face, knowing I can cut it off and stick it to the miniature is great. You can see here I've added a couple of like tribal runic style tattoos. There's no rhyme or reason here. What I quite like the triangles that they kind of have in the bold section. So what I've done here is just freehand this on with AK Black Red. You can use random shapes here, they all work nicely. I just find that triangles look really cool. I've also put a rune on the other side of the head as well. I've also blocked in the eyes with Black Legion, then filled in the eyeball with Ulthuan Grey, and then a dot of Black Legion. Like, trying to do that on camera is impossible. With the head complete, we can cut him off the spike, stick his head to his miniature, because we are done. I'm really happy with how the Terminator is looking. These are amazing miniatures. I had a great time painting them. As you can see here, I've got all 5 done, and Logan Grimnar as well. Logan is a wicked time to paint, but my word, that man is full of details. Quite glad I didn't pick him to do for this video, because we'd have been here for like hours. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this how I painted Space Wolves style video. If you want to see more of this, let us know in the comments and we can start picking out other bits and pieces that we painted to make videos for this. Thank you to this lovely list of Kieran's on the side of the screen, make all this possible. And if you want to pick up any of the Space Wolves that are out on pre-order, or the drop pods or anything else, make sure you click the affiliate links down below. Like I said, let us know in the comments down below if you want to see more of this. We can certainly look to do more. Check back in a couple of weeks for when other Kieran is going to do like a Chaos Space Wolf version of this. But yeah, we'll see you in the next one.